This is a bonus episode of the Death to Tyrants podcast. Let me tell you about one of my favorite sponsors, and that is Lucky Guy Bakery. Over at luckyguybakery.com, if really delicious, all-natural, handmade brownies sound like something you'd be into, well, this is the place for you. We're coming up on the holiday season, and I know a lot of you guys won't be traveling as much, probably as you did last year. Well, the brownies and treats over at Lucky Guy Bakery are the perfect gift idea. They come in really well-designed, handmade packaging, and each order has a handwritten note, which is a really nice personal touch that they do there at Lucky Guy Bakery. I could obviously go on and on about the flavors and tastes of the brownies. The new peanut butter bonanza bar is the most amazing peanut butter cookie bar that you will ever have. That is my Death to Tyrants guarantee. For those of you wondering if they have, something for your vegan or gluten-free friends, of course they do. Such a cool bakery, handmade items, all natural brownies, no preservatives ever, so many good flavors, such great packaging, such cool gift ideas, and they love this show. Let's give them some business. So go over to luckyguybakery.com and enter promo code DTTP at checkout for 20% off your order. It's an excellent product. They're great people. Their customer service is unparalleled. So go give them some support. Let's get to the show.
The crushing weight of the tyrant's passage had left nothing unmarked.
You get split in fucking half, but I call the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back once again to the Death to Tyrants podcast. As always, I'm your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson, coming to you out of Lockhart, Texas, and I'm bringing you a bonus episode. And we're going to get a few of these this month, and that's because, as I've mentioned on a few of the episodes, there are some big changes coming to this show starting in 2021, January, which is now just a few weeks away. They're good changes, I promise you that. But, I just figure we've got a few weeks left in this year, and I've got a lot of guests lined up to do this show, so might as well squeeze out as many as possible into the next few weeks, and that's what we're going to do. And I'm extremely fortunate to bring you this episode because I've got two of my favorite writers, two of the brightest young minds in the right-wing populist movement, and that would be James Girdusky and Pedro Gonzalez. And I'm stoked to have both of these guys here. We're going to talk about politics in general, where we're at, what happened with the election, what the Trump movement meant, Ryan's heated and fun thoughts on the libertarian world. That's one of my favorite parts of this interview, and where things should go from here. And so we touch upon all of those kind of things. I know you guys are going to like this. These guys are fun to chat with, and they're both really good at what they do, and they're dialed in quite well to the right-wing populist world. Let me tell you really quick, James Girdusky, he's a political consultant and writer whose work has been featured in multiple publications, including the Washington Examiner, the American Conservative Magazine, The Week, Human Events, The Daily Caller, and townhall.com. From 2015 to 2017, Ryan was the senior writer for conservative millennial website Red Alert Politics. He's also the author of a book called They're Not Listening, How the Elites Created the National Populist Revolution. Let me tell you quickly about Pedro Gonzalez. He is the assistant editor of American Greatness and a contributor at Chronicles, a magazine of American culture, one of my favorite magazines, I might add. Now, let's just get to this fun interview. James Girdusky, and Pedro Gonzalez. How are you guys? Welcome to the show.
Doing well. Good to be here.
Yeah, good. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, this is pretty damn cool for me, I got to admit. We'll start with you, Pedro, assistant editor over at American Greatness. Talk about that, what you do over there, and for those that don't know that are listening, what American Greatness is all about.
So what I do at American Greatness is a mixture of writing regular columns and copy editing. And so American Greatness arose to fill a need, which was a advocacy of and defense of the ideas of 2016 on which Trump campaigned to the White House. So a lot of people see AG as a magazine that exists to perform apologetics for Trump. That's not really how it began. It began more of a defense of the ideas. And the view is always that the movement is bigger than the man himself. So naturally, over the last 4 years, that's translated into a lot of defense of the man himself. But ultimately, the purpose of AG is to be a vehicle for new populism.
And Ryan Gardusky, you not only wrote They're Not Listening, How the Elites Created the Nationalist Populist Revolution, but you're also on one of my favorite podcasts, the Right Now podcast from American Conservative, and you put out an excellent newsletter. So if you want, talk about basically those things that you do so people get to know who you are.
Yeah, so I'm how I make my money is I'm a political consultant. I'm one of the best. I make my money by running and working on campaigns generally. But in my spare time, I wrote a book about the rise of national populism on a global level called They're Not Listening, and with my co-author Harlan Hill. And I host a podcast, American Conservative, with Jordan Bloom and Helen Andrews. Helen is on maternity leave if you're a listener of it. So she's on the last few episodes, but she's on the show. And I have a National Populist weekly newsletter that is suspended till January, but I'm planning on relaunching it and doing different content and more content, possibly on Substack come January. So I have all those things and a few other projects I'm working on right now.
Well, I'll start with you then, Ryan, because the subtitle, I suppose, of the book is How the Elites Created the National Populist Revolution. I guess, in short, how did they?
So after the Cold War ended, in the 1980s, there was a general consensus, and it's obviously most famously remembered by Francis Fukuyama's book about the end of history, that Western liberalism was the future of the world, that Tom Friedman how free markets and trade and global trade could be used to supplement nationalism and culture, and that it would change in a century-long-standing problems between people. And that there's a premise of a magic dirt with the United States, that democracy could be exported either through war, like in Iraq, through trade in China, or that if people arrived in our country literally tomorrow or yesterday, they would be as American as people who've been here for 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 generations. Like a Somalian family that, arrived yesterday would be the same as a 9th generation Wisconsin dairy farmer. None of those things are true. And it is a way to sit there and try to change human nature, how human nature operates. It's a very liberal and Wilsonian belief system. And is the people who hated Trump the most, who hate Brexit the most, who hate Orban and Le Pen and Salvini and Modi and, everyone of that ilk, all those people who hate them the most, the George W. Bushes and the Hillary Clintons and the Barack Obamas and the Joe Bidens, they are the ones who created the conditions to give rise to national populism.
And Pedro, let me ask you this. I guess, how long into politics were you prior to 2016?
Not very at all, actually. My background was more of an English literature guy. I was actually not really at all interested in politics, and my politics before 2016 were you could characterize as a stereotypical California liberal who thought that those were not politics at all, but just kind of facts of life. So.
And what pushed you then in this direction?
A mixture of different things, but it was what I recall of my early kind of political evolution was that the people who called themselves liberals, or like my peers, were always kind of dogmatic. It just dawned on me that wow, these people are actually kind of inflexible. And my friends, who I thought at the time were pretty radical, and others said were pretty radical, were actually always open to disagreement with me, and they would never become nearly as vicious as my liberal peers if I had a dispute with them. And it just something about that stuck with me is the people who I'm being told are actually supposed to be the intolerant ones are actually quite open to ideas that they don't personally agree with. And so I think that the key point in the change in my thought was when I came across this, at the time, obscure magazine called Chronicles. And I started reading through the archives of Chronicles. I don't really remember how this happened. I think it might have been something like someone saying, well, you shouldn't read that magazine, or someone saying, that this is kind of a home for these political outcasts like Sam Francis and Pat Buchanan.
Mm-hmm.
And that naturally made me curious. And so actually through reading the archives of Chronicles magazine was kind of how I started to look at politics and the world differently. And through reading the old columns of guys like Sam Francis, I was introduced to James Burnham.
Yes.
And Burnham, I was never a Trotskyite, but it's interesting that Burnham had a kind of a similar evolution where he went from being an avowed Trotskyite and a Marxist to something else. I wouldn't call him a neoconservative. I wouldn't call him a paleoconservative either, but he also went through this kind of left to this growing out of a left-wing phase throughout his life.
Yeah, it's interesting. Paul Gottfried over at Chronicles was raised as a Marxist, essentially, in his early studies. And I find it interesting that sometimes some of the best voices, maybe on the right, you could say, came from that experience. And that's interesting. And that you said you were a typical California liberal, which is not at all how I was going to assume your background. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Ryan, to this point as well, how has the political landscape changed just in the last 4 years? Because I come from the libertarian side of things, and one of my pet peeves with the people in the libertarian movement is that they're really stuck in a lot of times 2008, where they think, hey, both sides are the same. This is John McCain versus Barack Obama. And it's frustrating because things aren't the same, and it's changed quite a bit. How has it changed in your mind over the last 4 years?
Since 2008, I mean, it's a world different. It's the same party at all. I mean, I remember when I turned, I guess I was 21 and 20. It was the first election I voted in was 2008. And I remember I voted for John McCain because I was like, oh, that's just, you vote for one of the other. I didn't vote for Mitt Romney, but I voted for John McCain. But when Ron Paul had that debate where he debated Rudy Giuliani, I mean, it was like a giant red pill for a generation of young people who had never heard anything outside of because I was a Democrat, anything outside of what the left had been saying is if you're pro-war, then you are a Republican. The evolution of that, I mean, you had Tom Cotton, who this year, I mean, Tom Cotton is a very openly pro-regime change senator. In 2015, in 2020, he's at the Republican National Convention telling Republicans that it's not our mission to change the world. This is a dramatically different party. Is it so much so in policy? Not so. I mean, it's not a radical change. It's not 180, but the change is noticeable. Take George W. Bush, for example, after the attacks of 9/11. You have the complete creation of the Department of Homeland Security. You have huge executive powers. You have spying power. The expansion of the National Security Council, of the NSA. All these things happen in a time of crisis. Well, look what's happened with COVID. Donald Trump has exerted almost no new executive powers, except for maybe on trade to try to stop things from going to China. That would not happen if Joe Biden were president or Barack Obama was president or if George W. Bush was president. And maybe it's because he is what many libertarians and people on the right and people on the left who hate him say of him, that he is, a fat, lazy retard who just doesn't really care about doing the job. Okay, maybe that's true. That is, that's an argument. But wouldn't you rather have that than somebody who's crazy power hungry? Yeah, maybe Donald Trump is an egomaniac. Okay. But he is not who wants to sit there and exert new controls over the entire institution that is this country. And that is a general change in the Republican Party was not calling on him to gain more powers, more executive powers. So purely from the viewpoint of where a libertarian would care about, he didn't decriminalize pot. He didn't sit there and give an amnesty to Assad or a pardon to Assad. He probably never read a Milton Friedman book in his life, and he probably thinks Milton Friedman's a man who works in his cabinet. But that doesn't matter. What matters at the end of the day is where average people are and where average people are on the issues. He is a lot closer, and his lack of willingness to exert huge executive power. I mean, he didn't have the perfect White House by any stretch of the imagination, but even have people around him to exert huge executive powers. And I wrote in the book that in 2000, George W. Bush campaigned on a humble foreign policy, no nation building. That's what his campaign theme was in 2000. Then he hired Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, everyone else. I don't know if I can curse on this podcast, but this is according to Colin Powell. Colin Powell said, I looked over and everywhere I looked was someone who was a quote fucking crazy.
Yeah.
That was Trump's White House the best in the world? No. A lot of people I hated, including Jared Kushner, were in the White House. It wasn't a bunch of people who were telling him you could be the next George W. Bush. And in fact, being a Bush person was something that was looked down upon in this White House. That is a dramatic change in a period of just 6 or 7 years. Now, Pedro's going to go on and completely shut up the White House and say why I'm wrong, but that is a huge progress from where we were as a party 5 years ago.
Yes, well put. Pedro, your thoughts on that?
I actually think Ryan's one of the first things he said is correct, that rhetorically the party has certainly changed, which you could also argue is perhaps superficially, but in terms of policy, we still got a long way to go. And I think that there is a tendency in the GOP to want to regress and to go back to the ideas that made the GOP so unpopular and unpalatable to Americans before Trump came along and kind of revived it with populism. I think that maybe people like Tom Cotton, their heart is in the right place, and they can be kind of led to better waters, you could say. But I'm still not optimistic about the GOP overall. I think that overwhelmingly, this is what the GOP excels at, is taking populist dissident currents and using them to kind of not rehabilitate, but revive themselves, revive itself as an institution, but ultimately assimilate those currents and incorporated them into the existing political system. So what begins as populism ultimately kind of fizzles out as more of the same. And I think I'm not poo-pooing all of Ryan's what he had to say, because I think there's a lot of truth to that. But I also think there's reason to not be overly optimistic about it. And I think Trump himself is a perfect example of this. He's someone who ran as a kind of barbarian, promised to break up the managerial regime and to break up the consensus. But he actually kind of got assimilated into it. And we saw this early on in 2017 when, instead of infrastructure, which is probably his most popular platform promise, took a backseat to tax cuts. And who was the architect of the tax cuts plan? It was Gary Cohn, the former president and COO of Goldman Sachs. And after that, we had criminal justice reform. And then our response to the coronavirus involved bringing in McKinsey people, the infamous McKinsey consultants. So I think that if Trump struggled to reform this party, and in some ways, if Trump, the master of the art of the deal, if he got played in a lot of cases, I think it shows how difficult it is to fix the Republican Party. And in a lot of ways, what happened to Trump is the same thing that happened to Reagan. Reagan promised, vowed to reduce the size of the federal government, but by the time he left office, the federal government was bigger than ever. So I think that there are reasons to
But Reagan did reduce the domestic federal government. On domestic spending, Reagan did. It's just we also fought a Cold War. And Pedro's right. Pedro's right with all his criticisms. Yes, Trump surrounded himself with very, very, very incompetent, stupid, lazy people also who hated his guts and hated his voters, mostly Jared Kushner and a lot of at the advice of Jared Kushner. So I'm not disagreeing with Pedro. But I think that what Pedro is discount is you are looking only at action, not at inaction. And I think that is a very, very big difference. The inaction taken on the part of President Trump and on the part of the Republicans speaks volumes, because there wasn't a general conversation. Even when I ran down our drum, you did not have a drumbeat to war in the way that you did in 2001. I'm sorry for cutting you off. I just wanted to add that.
Oh, it's fine. No, I think we don't fundamentally disagree. But I'm also not as optimistic as you are that the GOP is done being the war party. In fact, I think that the peace deals in the Middle East are actually about not peace, but creating a coalition against Iran. And there was a report today on the Hill that Israel has been told to prepare for a possible strike on Iran by the United States before January 20th. So again, I'm sorry. I don't mean to. I absolutely don't think you're totally wrong, Ryan. But I'm just you're optimistic and I'm pessimistic.
That's
you know, when I am the optimistic voice in the room, in any room, it's a room where razor blades are going to start being distributed en masse, and everyone's going to start sweating up their veins. It's just I'm not an overly optimistic person, but I'm just sitting there and saying is that it is the character presented by a lot of people is just not complete. And I'm not saying you, Pedro, because you're brilliant.
Thank you.
But despite my shitting on you on Twitter, you are a brilliant person. But the people you deserve it on Twitter. But the people, the caricature by people from the left, which say that Trump is a fascist, to libertarians who say that Trump is just as bad as, you know, George W. Bush or Obama. The fact that Trump's margin of error in most of these states is between winning and losing is the libertarian vote is so infuriating because that makes me want to use a blunt object on libertarians. I mean, it just does, sitting there and seeing them vote like that. You're going to sit there and choose, you know, the cop Kamala and the aging Joe Biden as your. I mean, that is my ultimate problem with libertarians as a people. They live in a third world fantasy that is like on a game console, not the real world. They will not sit there and objectively understand. There are two parties you vote for. Only in some special local elections do you get the choice of having a libertarian elected. Voting for libertarian for president is like using a vibrator made out of Nerf. You're not going to get anything using that.
Well, I got to stand up for some. I do know there's a decent segment of this audience that did vote for Trump. And there's a few reasons. And one reason being,
well, then bless you. I'm talking about you, though.
Yes. And I try to, I want this show to be for a lot of people, but I do tailor it a little bit to the more red-pilled libertarians that aren't just, hey, Jo Jorgensen says XYZ, that's why I vote for her. There's a bigger culture war, in my opinion, here. Hey guys, let's take a minute to talk about one of our sponsors, and that is Lorenzotti Coffee. I love these guys, not just because they were our very first sponsor, but because, like I've said many times, their coffee is so damn good. If you guys like coffee that tastes the way coffee is actually supposed to taste, you know, with natural flavors that come from the region and the roast of the beans, rather than from artificial flavorings like some other brands use, well, then you'll love Lorenzotti Coffee. If you're a real coffee drinker like myself, you don't want these weird flavors in your coffee like key lime pie or blueberry muffin. You want strong, traditional flavors that actually come from the beans themselves, and that's exactly what you get with Lorenzotti Coffee. You can get Lorenzotti's signature Venetian blend. This stuff comes right from Italy, okay? You can do whole beans, medium fine grind, which that one's actually perfect to use in the French press like I prefer. It comes in these really cool, beautifully designed, resealable tins that ship to you, hermetically sealed, and keep the coffee very, very fresh. Guys, I cannot speak highly enough of Lorenzotti. They're lovers of liberty. They love this show. They support this show. So why not support them by getting yourself some damn good coffee? So go to lorenzotti.coffee. That is LORENZOTTI.coffee. Guess what? We got a promo code, and that, as you know, is DTTP for Death to Tyrants Podcast. You'll get 10% off your order at checkout. Again, that's lorenzotti.coffee. Enter code DTTP at checkout. Let's get back to the show. One of the brilliant things about Trump, and my friend Alana Mercer calls this the process of Trump. I'm not even sure he did it on purpose. That's the great debate. Did he or did he not? Right. But he has this brilliancy to unmask some of the worst people in the government, and actually, now that I say that, in society as well. I know some of them, unfortunately, but the forces, the military-industrial complex, like we were talking about Burnham and these authors that write about the managerial state, and Trump somehow unmasks a lot of those people. And what libertarians need to realize, those people hate us too. Yes. Those are the people that we're fighting against. So if you can put a debate about tariffs on the back burner for the time being, or driver's licenses, there's a broader fight here going on. And for some reason, the left has continued to win the fight in the culture war over they've done it incrementally over centuries. Go ahead.
I'll say one thing and then I'll let Pedro talk. But because libertarians cared more about fucking soybean tariffs than the fact that their president disclosed that aliens were real. Like, this was the guy who truly didn't give a shit about things and was like, yeah, fuck it, aliens are real. You want to know who killed JFK? Let's talk about the CIA. This is a guy who, okay, maybe 9 times out of 10 he didn't actually step foot through the door that we want him to, but 1 of the 10 times he did. And okay, I mean, he's the fundamental problem that we have on the right is that so many people who are politicians want to be the right-wing answer to AOC. They want to be revolutionary. They want to do all these great things, Trump included. AOC and the institutions that support the mainstream Republican and Democratic Party, they have things like the DSA, like the Justice Democrats, like Chakrabarty creating policies like the Green New Deal on the far left. And in the center, they have the Heritage Foundation or AEI or Goldman Sachs or, Cato or whatever you have. They have institutions to pluck staff from. To become president, you need to hire 30,000 people. Sure, it didn't help that Trump, for the first 2.5 years, had John Boehner's former coffee boy doing all the hiring. That wasn't a great thing. But he did. But we did not have the institutions available to sit there and hire 30,000 people throughout the entire government. In order to sit there and create real institutional change, you don't need to run for office. You need to build those institutions so that way, when the next president who wants to blow up the system comes around, they don't sit there and say, hey, I got to go to Heritage Foundation because I have nowhere else to go, or my family because I have nowhere else to go. They will have a nationalist or populist or some kind of third wave think tank. They won't have to go to Heritage and say, give me the big 5 fucking retards you have on your staff who hate my guts. But unfortunately, Trump had none of those institutions, and that is the problem that we face going forward. Go ahead, Pedro. I'm sorry.
It's okay. You're heated up. I can see. So I think, Buck, you said something important, and that is that Trump kind of helped the establishment discredit itself. Mm-hmm. And so when I am critical of Trump, and I often am, it's not because I don't believe in the ideas of 2016. It's not because I want the movement to fail. I've always thought that Trump was a kind of transitional figure, a step in the right direction. And I think that the reflection is necessary right now to see where he went wrong so that we can continue this thing and we can move in the right direction. And we can strip off the parts that were wrong and become more disciplined and more serious and more formidable so that the next time that this happens, if there is a next time, and I think that there will be, we are more effective. So all of my criticisms about Trump are always going in that direction of being constructive. And I think that this is definitely Trump's biggest contribution to our politics. And that just his existence has made the ruling class, you could say, so enraged that they've kind of showed us, what they're really about. Yeah. Like you had James Mattis today.
Yes.
Or not today, but recently say that he hopes Biden takes America first out of our foreign policy. You've had the media completely discredit itself, make itself just totally beclown itself by the way that it's reacted to Trump. I think that Trump has, this is his biggest contribution to us, is to show us how deep the rot goes in the regime.
Yeah.
And with that in mind, I think that we can start to fight more effectively, because I think the fundamental problem with conservatism before Trump is that conservatism exists to conserve institutions that either do not exist or are so thoroughly corrupted that they are just caricatures of themselves. They don't really exist anymore, and they're just in name only. And I think that this has historically kept conservatives from fighting as hard as they should or in the ways that they should, because they see themselves as conserving something. But when you look around, I think Trump has shown us that a lot of this stuff actually needs to get torn down, not conserved. So I think that's your point is really important, that Trump has showed us how bad things really are. Probably not on purpose, just the fact, like Ryan said, this is the last thing I'll say. People think that he's a fascist and stuff. Trump is the nicest fascist I have ever heard about. He let rioting get worse and worse because his advisors told him that if you intervene, it'll look racist.
Yeah.
If this guy is a fascist, we should be so blessed, or that history should be so blessed about fascism, because it actually seems pretty soft. But no, I think you're right that this is something that Trump did unwittingly.
Yeah.
I think.
To the
Sorry, Ryan, you cut.
Right.
Sorry. When he was doing the rubber bullets, I wanted a Pinochet type figure sitting there and shooting him down. I mean, that's what a real right wing fascist would have looked like. Not Trump with smoke guns and rubber bullets while he walks to the church to hold the Bible up because Ivanka told him to.
Right. And to that point, there was a quote recently, kind of a sentiment of the populist uprising, and it said something along the lines of, Trump was us asking nicely.
Yes.
And I think it's interesting. I've heard theories that, if the establishment, we'll call it, keeps pushing against these people, because the Trump movement's there. The man, we'll see what happens with these court processes and everything by January, but the movement's there. And I feel like enough people have been red-pilled and enough masks have been taken away from the evil people. I'm not sure that they can push too much further, because the left has won incrementally over the decades, and now they're pushing giant leaps and bounds. There could be a worse movement spring up in the next few years. Your thoughts on that, Pedro?
Yes. No, I think actually the left has a better understanding of this than the right does at this point, because the right is really focused, and understandably so. The right has galvanized around Trump, and that's I understand that. But Trump is just the beginning, and the left knows this, and they are terrified of it. David Brooks in 2017 wrote an article called "The Coming War on Business," and in that article he talked about Sam Francis and how he was kind of the pioneer of this right populism, this anti-corporate right-wing movement. And the article concludes by David Brooks in the New York Times saying that Trump is the first iteration of this San Franciscan character, this guy that's going to come in with a hammer and smash the regime, that he's the first version of it, and that there's likely going to be someone else who follows that's going to be more serious and more disciplined and more ideological. That was in 2017. And you had an article in The Atlantic, the last name of the author is Tufekci, I think, and they also wrote the same thing. Obviously, they claim that Trump was kind of a clumsy fascist. And the next one is not going to be so clumsy. The next one is kind of watching and waiting and learning from Trump's mistakes. And authoritarian, that's the term they use. Trump is a clumsy authoritarian. The next one will be much more serious. And then I think after that, Jacobin also published another article with the same thesis, that Trump is just the beginning of something, and that the left should not be popping bottles yet, because this is just the beginning of what is to come. And obviously, a lot of this is overblown, the whole thing about Trump being some a borderline dictator. We've already talked about this. It's absurd. But the basic truth of this is there, that Trump is just the beginning, and they know that they've pushed his base. And most decent people in this country who probably just voted for Trump because they see how insane the opposition is, they know that they've kind of pushed these people about as close as you can push them before really bad things start happening. And so that's what I think it's important to look at the left and pay attention to what they're saying,
yes,
and incorporate that into what we are doing. In other words, if they're worried about us becoming more serious and more disciplined, then maybe we should become more serious and more disciplined.
Ryan, your thoughts?
Yeah, Pedro's right. Pedro's 100% right. Rather than throwing $35 million a year at Charlie Kirk so he could sell Socialism Sucks t-shirts, we should probably be creating the institutions to actually train people to staff an administration and Senate offices. I mean, here's the truth about most politicians, that if you've never worked with politicians, I'll tell you, most politicians don't have an idea until someone gives them an idea. That's just how they work, how their brains work. I have asked politicians, hey, why didn't you do this? And they said, no one's ever told me to do it before. They are, and I'm just talking about what seems very obvious to people like you and I. And, if you are somebody of my political leanings, what I tell people that is encouraging, even if Trump's losing the White House, there is things that you could do on every level of government to push the movement forward. It just, you need more than just me screaming on Twitter to do it. And I think finally the people who have power and money and access are sitting there and starting to at least ask the right questions and answer the right things and saying, oh, maybe this is not, maybe we could do, on a state legislative level, we could do something to end the war. And I actually spoke to a state legislator from Idaho 2 days ago, and the first bill he's doing is the Respect the Guard bill. I think it's called Defend the Guard bill. And what it is to say that National Guardsmen cannot serve indefinitely overseas. First bill, that's a great America First policy, saying that libertarians and conservatives agree with.
Yes.
It's going to be 4 very tough years with Joe Biden administratively, because they'll probably be a lot more competent than the Trump people will be. And you'll have the media doing cheerleading dances. Like Andrea Mitchell today was or yesterday she said something to the effect of, Biden's staff is amazing because they're not political. I mean, these people are brain dead. And then, but at the end of the day, what I would say always to libertarians is unless it's a local election or a state legislative election, you don't have the choice between having somebody who's not either a Republican or Democrat. You can growth within the party, you can change the party, and to the national populist people, you're not going to have an America First party. And unless we change the first past the post system we have. Same reason why the UK is essentially only 3 major parties. Same reason why France is ever really only over 3 or 4 major parties. Insurgency parties in nations like ours that have the voting system that we have. I mean, even like Marine Le Pen, her party, which was Front National, now it's Rally for the Nation in France. They got something like a third of the electoral vote in the last legislative election, and they got 8 seats out of 650. You can't really make huge inroads in places like that with this. It's not proportional representation. So please stop with the bullshit third-party voting. So we're going to have Joe Biden who's going to tax your guns because you were mad about soybeans. You have to sit there and think as more of a political person, I think more than anything. And I think the one thing I hope for with Trump, and I'm not convinced it's going to happen yet. It may not happen for a generation, but I really hope that we can move past the rhetoric of boomer zombie Reaganism.
Yes.
And I think that is so bad for our politics. I talked to Dave Bratt on my podcast today, and Dave Bratt, who is a free market guy, sat there and said, we don't have a free market in any part of, or basically any part of America. There's no such thing as a free market.
Right.
He's like, you cannot build a house without government intervention on every level of the way.
Yep.
And that's true.
Yeah.
It's just 100% true, whether we like it or not. So rather than sitting there and saying we have to defend the integrity of this, that, and the other thing, quit the bullshit. At a certain point, politics is about 2 major things. One is winning, and secondly is doing things positively for the people who put you in power. Trump won the first time, but he failed to do the second thing throughout his administration. It's very complicated. It's very hard. I'm not just shitting on him. He did some good things, not all good things. But those are the 2 essential things. And that, for Republicans, they couldn't understand for a really, really long time. And I think that's what hopefully comes out of the next person. Is one, we have to win. And then secondly, we have to reward voters who cast their ballots for us.
Yeah, and to your point about the third-party stuff, and that gets frustrating for sure. And I would argue that Trump is about the closest thing we've had to a third-party candidate win. Because, Let's face it, his own party did not want him. Obviously, the other one didn't. And it shows me that it may be more beneficial to work within the system and at least try to wreck it up if you can, which is, this man beat the Bushes and the Clintons. And I think that cannot be understated enough, because he essentially was his own third-party candidate and made his way through the system as it is structured, unfortunately. But sometimes that is what you have to do.
Yeah, and I voted for third party in 2012 because I lived in New York State and I know it was never going to go red. So sure, go ahead, have a fantasy with a mental masturbation about third party. But for God's sakes, if you live in a state that's a swing state, do the right thing.
Yeah.
I'll say this about the Bush point, and this I think goes back to what I and Ryan have been saying about building institutions, because Buck, you said that Trump beat the Bushes, but look at who's in the White House. Look at how many people in the White House are basically, they're Bushites, like Derek Lyons. The White House is filled with people in senior roles that would be perfectly comfortable under any Bush or Obama. And I think that this is the difficulty of the GOP, is that on the outside, it looks like this dinky little ship with a skeleton crew, something very easy to raid and take over. But once you get on board, it's like you get hoodwinked. It's actually not that easy to take control of the ship. And the funding structure and the institutional structure of the GOP, it pulls you into it. And before you know it, like, you're not really in control of that ship anymore. And actually, this is a much harder thing to steer in the direction you want it to go. And the difficulty is that you're right. Trump did come in and do some things and change some things. So you can't say it was a total failure, I guess. But it's frustrating because it's like if you wish that Trump was more serious and that he had more he had personnel different than what he has now, kind of at the ready, because it leaves this unanswered question. Is it possible to run someone who's basically, like you said, a third party candidate, but run them within the GOP and then have them basically conduct a top-down hostile takeover of the GOP? Is it possible? And I think that question is still unanswered because Trump tried and I think more or less kind of failed. But because he was not aware of how, again, the structure of the GOP, the fact that all of the people that he was being fed by guys like Jared Kushner, these are all Bushies. Like all the people that Jared was like reaching out to and saying like, I'm going to put you here, I'm going to put you here. A lot of these people were Bushites. And of course, like Trump doesn't know that. Like, so he just listens to his advisors who say, oh, this guy's competent. He's been in DC for a long time. He knows how to do this. Turns out that guy was a former campaign manager for Jeb Bush. That's Derek Lyons. That's one example.
Well, I think there's two things. One is that Trump did not care about the institutional powers of Washington for a very long time until he hired John McEntee at PPO. Yeah. He really, truly did not understand or care how institutions work. Right. And I think that the second problem is that you had him relying on really, really bad people because there were no institutions. Trump got by. Truly think about this. Trump got by the Republican primary to win the nomination. He essentially really only had 4 or 5 staffers that were full-time that were actually working with him. There was a guy going to do rallies on his private plane from place to place. That's really all it was. And what came after that was really a revolution of thought of how people perceive politics. I mean, if Trump was unsuccessful and he didn't win the nomination and he didn't sit there and become president, there would not be things like American greatness. Tucker Carlson probably would not have been given a television show to have a platform like he has now. All of that change started because of him, but I think that the really serious political people want something besides, sorry, that's my dog in the background being a complete jackass, who want something besides Mitch McConnell version of republicanism have to start building it.
Yes, yeah, that's exactly right. I agree that Trump's contribution was a change in the discourse and in the culture. But in terms of like fundamentally changing the GOP, no, there's still a lot of work to go there. But again, like you said, and like I've said, Trump had no idea what he was getting himself into with the GOP.
Yeah, but like look at right now. We have Jim Banks being the head of the Republican Study Committee. Jim is a guy who I know read my book. I'm not best friends with him, but he's somebody who keeps an open ear to nationalists and to populists and to libertarians. He's somebody who has questions on things that are not standard Milton Friedman or George W. Bush neocon politics. Mm-hmm. Is he a perfect test case? No. Look at what Marco Rubio is talking about. Look at what Cotton's talking about. Look at what Hawley's talking about. Are they perfect inceptions of what we want them to be? No, but no politician is, because that's just the nature of human beings. But you're seeing a general curiosity, a conversation they want to have, a movement they want to start, where they see 73 or 74 million people who voted for Donald Trump and said, wow, I can pick that up. What I always allude this to is that the national populist movement, or people who follow like kind of my politics or the campaign of 2016, is like a puzzle, right? You have issues on trade, issues on immigration, issues on national security state, issues on the deep state, issues on war. And right now you have a bunch of politicians who are grabbing at pieces, but they're not picking up the full puzzle the way that the Trump campaign of 2016 did. And I think the first person who can sit there and actually put that puzzle or most of it back together again is going to be the one who can actually do things.
I want to tell you guys about a great sponsor of the Death to Tyrants podcast, and that is our friends over at Zipix Toothpicks. These are flavored toothpicks. They've got several great flavors. Check these out: cinnamon, clove, mocha, and whiskey even. But not only that, each toothpick actually contains nicotine, and I use these toothpicks all of the time. Not only are they a great alternative to that nasty habit you may be trying to stop, and that includes vaping, come on now, but they taste great. They are way more socially acceptable. They are cheaper than any alternative. Hell, I don't even dip or smoke or anything like that, and I still love these Zipix toothpicks. Out of all the alternatives on the market, these are the most cost-effective, and better yet, they are a sponsor of this show. When a small business is out there helping to support one of your favorite Liberty podcasts like this one, let's thank them by returning the support. Since you are a loyal listener to the Death to Tyrants podcast, you will get 10% off of your order by entering promo code DTTP at checkout when you order over at ZipixToothpicks.com. Once again, go to ZipixToothpicks.com, that's ZIPPIX, toothpicks.com, and type in promo code DTTP for Death to Tyrants podcast at checkout, and you will get 10% off of your order, and you will be supporting Zipix and Death to Tyrants at the same time. So go do it. Let's get back to the show. I think one of the most, probably the biggest fight we're about to see on our hands here, not counting on if we go to war or not. I hope that's not the case. But aside from that is this tech censorship issue, because it's getting bigger, and under a Biden presidency, I suspect it's going to get worse and worse. And I suspect there's going to be some retribution against the red states from tech overlords and deep state figures in a Biden administration. This is a tough one for libertarians, and I don't really know the answer right now, and I'm searching, and I don't want to just say, well, I have these principles and I'm not going to, betray them no matter what, because like you said, politics is war, and that's what we're going to have to realize here. I want to get y'all's opinion on what is the best thing to be done to fight this constant censorship. I mean, the framework of allowable opinion is getting narrower and narrower, and libertarians can sit there and say, well, I've got my principles. Well, you're going to be pushed out soon and no one's going to hear you. And so, Pedro, what are your thoughts on this tech censorship issue and what should be done moving forward from our side?
Well, I have a very anti-libertarian proposal. That is
I thought you might. I want to hear it.
Right. I think that these companies need to either be destroyed, not broken up into little pieces like a monopoly, but just totally dissolved, or reduced to like public carriers. And I think that, or the threat of this, basically the threat of nationalization, needs to be put on the table. Either you fix yourself, or we're just going to take control of you and make you stop existing, or we're going to turn you into kind of a public transit system for information. Now, there's obviously a lot of problems with this, like there is with any solution, but the reason I went right for this solution was because I don't see reform possible. Like the fiddling with Section 230 doesn't really seem like it's going to work. I mean, if you get rid of that, then it's just going to, I think, incentivize censorship, because then they'll be liable for content posted on their platform. So they'll just kick you off their platform so that they're not liable for anything you post. Reforming it, no matter what, at the end of the day, Google has better lawyers than anyone that they're going to come up against, and they're probably going to win in court all the time. And they're also willing to kind of like outlast politicians. Like they're willing to outlast people like Trump, and they have the money and resources to do it. So I think that an extreme non-normative solution is probably the one that I'm going to look to, or at least start there and maybe work back from there, because I don't see Josh Hawley fiddling with regulatory stuff as the solution for something as massive as Google, as powerful as Twitter or Facebook. These people have so much money and they own politicians. Like, I think that's the other problem of this is, how do you get politicians to reform big tech when big tech owns a lot of these politicians?
Right.
So I think it's reduction. It sounds a bit reductivist, but I think that you do need a kind of Trump character, someone to come in and basically cow big tech and cow politicians into getting this done, which I think obviously didn't really happen under Trump. But that's where my mind goes on this question.
And Ryan?
Yeah, big tech's not an issue I know enough about to give a real thorough policy answer on. I would say if you want the most realistic thing right now, you should call your senator to confirm Nathan Symington for the FCC board, because he has spoken openly about he would be the deciding vote on a lot of big tech stuff when it comes to their censorship. and their ability to call themselves a platform and not a publisher. I think that would be one big thing. And aside from that, I think we have a cultural problem in Silicon Valley. So I just think whatever comes out of Silicon Valley is naturally going to be fairly left-wing. And we can't not have Silicon Valley. The United States as a country cannot, fall behind China, fall behind Japan, fall behind parts of Europe. We just can't fall behind them. Maybe the threat of nationalization, it works, but the problem is we also have NPR, and we have that crazy woman on, Yamidi, whatever her name is, sitting there and screaming about how Trump's a fascist every 5 seconds. So I don't really have an answer for this. I think that the thing that I would look for the most right now is supporting Nathan Symington to be on the FCC board and to call your senator about confirming him. I think that's the best thing you could do right now as far as changing the culture of big tech.
Nationalize NPR.
I know that wasn't a great answer. I don't. What did you say?
I said nationalize NPR too.
Well, NPR is nationalized.
No, it was created by Congress, but it's the funding structure of NPR is really strange. It's like a public-private thing, but theoretically, the federal government could kind of, I think, take control of it and then just like fire and hire people. It's kind of like a TVA situation, the Tennessee Valley Authority. It's kind of like that.
Yeah.
But I mean,
I'm sorry. There's no way. If Trump could fire people on NPR, all he does is watch television. He would have people fired constantly.
Yeah, there you go.
Have Pat Buchanan run the program and get NPR.
Right, but I don't know if they. I know it's not a bad idea, but next time I see Pat, I'll tell him. But I just think that it's going to be. I think it's just harder said than done. I think right now the constant threat of FCC and losing their protections. I think they're far more scared of losing their protections than they are being nationalized, because I don't think that they see a Jacksonian figure willing to actually do that as of right now.
I want to ask you. Right. I want to ask you guys both this before we get out of here. I don't even want to assume this. The last guy interview said he's pretty certain Trump still is going to be the president in February 2021. If that is not the case,
how is Rudy Giuliani? Sorry, never mind.
If that is not the case, if that is not the case, and we do get a Biden-Harris presidency, Pedro, you go first. What's the next? Over the next 4 years, what's the biggest threat that you see?
The biggest threat is the dissolution of the movement that Trump began, or the spiraling out of control of that movement. And I think that demoralization would probably result in dissolution and a deep cynicism. Now, all those things are bad. And I think the spiraling out of control could ironically be the result of Trump trying to run again in 2024. Or propping up one of his kids. More than likely, there's a 99.9% chance that if anyone runs the Trump family, it's going to be Ivanka. And I think that would actually be, obviously, the left, that's a clear and obvious threat, is all this stuff that Democrats and the left want to do. So I'm just putting this other stuff that I think other people are not thinking enough about.
Sure.
And if we see like an Ivanka platform, I think that would actually be really bad for the movement, because it would, I think, in a way, kind of spiritually kill the movement that started in 2016. So I think that the biggest threat the movement faces is, like I said, either it dissolving or it kind of being hijacked. The biggest threat that is not the left of the Democrats. And so I think the solution for that is, again, we need to do some soul searching, and we need to start building things, and we can't. I think we have to kind of move past Trump as much as possible and build things on our own and prepare for what's coming next.
Ryan?
Yeah, I don't think that we're going to move past Trump anytime soon. And I think, in fact, that a free Trump who won't be president anymore may be a better Trump, especially if he decides to enact vengeance on a lot of the Republicans who are in Congress right now. I think that would actually be the best case scenario. Worst case scenario is that Republicans lose the 2 seats in Georgia, Democrats have 50-50, they break up the filibuster, or they don't break up the filibuster, they just have they have the majority-ship in the Senate, and they get an amnesty. Because an amnesty will be 25 million new people, probably 10 million new Democrats, and America is over. That would be our worst case scenario. So do anything you possibly can to save the 2 Senate seats in Georgia because Western civilization depends on it. I mean, that is the most important thing right now, is making sure Republicans have, as much as I don't like Mitch McConnell, I'd rather have him as leader of the Senate than Chuck Schumer any of the week, and Chuck Grassley as head of Judiciary, which controls immigration. Grassley's a pretty good hardliner, although he said some very delirious thing the other day. I just don't believe it, though, because Grassley's essentially very, very good on immigration. And Biden has openly stated that he wants an amnesty bill in the first 100 days. If we can kill this, if we keep the Senate majority and Democrats only have a 4-seat majority in the House or 5-seat majority in the House, whatever it is, and we kill this, we'll have a great 2022 midterm elections. And in the 2022 midterm elections, primary every single Republican. Langford, Cheney, even if you're not going to win, primary every single one of them, except for maybe, like a handful, except for like a very, very few that are actually pretty good on the issues. Just go across the board and put the fear of God in the Republican Party and start doing things to actually change it on a fundamental level, from school boards to the U.S. Senate and governorships. And I think that is the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is Democrats get the Senate majority, get the presidency, get the House, we get an amnesty bill, and it's 1,000 years of darkness.
All right, Pedro, I want you to plug anything you want to, your social media presence, American Greatness, all of that stuff before we go.
Yeah, so you can follow me in my newsletter if you just go to Twitter at Emeriticus, EMERITICUS. And in my bio is a newsletter. And in that newsletter, I send out, it's not as regular as Ryan's, but I send out my work. So whenever I write a column, I usually will email it to people through there. So if you want to follow me there and get my periodic newsletter, my hot takes and me yelling at Ryan on Twitter.
Yes.
That's where you can go.
and we can, of course, see you on Tucker Carlson from time to time.
Yeah. If I'm so lucky.
Yes. And Ryan, plug away, man. Plug away anything you want.
So my book is They're Not Listening, How the Elites Created the National Populist Revolution. It is on Amazon, Barnes & Noble's, Target, wherever books are sold, Books A Million. My newsletter, you can sign up on my website, ryangardusky.com. If you go to Twitter at Ryan Girdusky, you can sign up for my newsletter. It's usually every week. I haven't put it out since the election. I'm not putting it out till January, but starting January, hopefully it'll be out every week again in some capacity or the other. Twitter at Ryan Girdusky, Facebook Ryan James Girdusky, although I don't really ever go on there. And my website, ryangardusky.com. Sign up for the newsletter, and I'll send, when I start sending stuff out, I will send out more stuff.
Yeah, I will link to all of that in the show notes page for this episode, and I can second that about his newsletter. And Pedro, I've got to subscribe to yours too. I apologize for being tardy on that.
His newsletter is very good. It's very, very good.
Yes. Ryan, I get a lot of stuff daily in my email inbox, articles and newsletters and whatnot, but I really mean this. Every time I get yours, I read it top to bottom, and it's probably my favorite newsletter to get in my email inbox. So thank you guys so much for both being here. This has been really cool. Right-wing populism ×2. Thank you, Pedro, and thank you, Ryan. We'll see you guys. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed that chat. You might have heard a few of the audio glitches. As you know, I've got the best producer in this game, but that was the Skype connection. There were some issues here and there, but I hope it wasn't too bothersome for you. And thanks again to Ryan and Pedro for doing that. How cool was that? And I'm glad you guys have enjoyed this bonus episode. More to come, guys. More to come. Talk to you soon.
You get split in fucking half, but I call him the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Death to Tyrants podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.